Next, as the death toll continues to rise in Gaza, Britain's support for Israel has shifted. Both major parties had urged caution about the idea of a ground invasion of Rafah, and Labour this week has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It led to a dramatic evening in Parliament after Speaker Lindsay Hoyle allowed Labour to bring its amendment to vote, upending years of parliamentary procedure. To discuss what the UK's position on Rafah should be, I'm joined by journalist Peter Oborne and writer Jake Wallis-Simmons. Peter, Jake, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. So Peter, to begin with you, it feels as though when it comes to the two main parties, there are still a few differences, but generally speaking, the attitude towards Israel has become more hostile in the past week or so. Would you agree with that?
I think I put it in a different way, that to begin with, we had a kind of cross-party merger between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, which was quite fascinating. I mean, Keir Starmer decided not to play the role you'd normally expect in a major issue like this, of being leader of the opposition. He became a sort of subcontractor of Rishi Sunak's foreign policy positions and repeatedly failed to interrogate the British government. And this led that both parties were over-enthusiastic, in my view, in their support for Benjamin Netanyahu's attacks on Gaza. Just think about the devastation we've seen. I mean, we've now got 29,400 dead in a population of, and that's a conservative estimate from the Gaza Health Authority, in a population of 2 million. We have seen a slight move away from that unconditional support. So I wouldn't say it's towards hostility to Israel, but I would say a little bit less friendly towards Israel.
And Jake, we're talking about the changing attitudes towards Israel's actions in Gaza. If the Israeli ground operation invasion of Rafah goes ahead, we can expect widespread condemnation. There's lots of efforts right now to try and dissuade the Israeli government from taking that step. Why is it, do you think, that the IDF do see it as a needed step?
Well, because that's, as I said, Hamas's last redoute. Hamas had about, 24 battalions to begin with in the war. Most of them had been destroyed or disrupted significantly. But I think there are about 4 or so stationed in Rafah. And if they are not countered and destroyed, then Hamas will grow back and take power again. Well, that's the danger. They certainly won't be out of the picture. Rafah is particularly important because that's where the smuggling tunnels exist from Egypt into Gaza, which is where Hamas learned how to tunnel, really, back in the 80s and 90s. And so Hamas will be able to rearm via those tunnels if they're not taken out in Rafah. And overall, I think we need to look at the bigger picture, which is that Hamas has genocidal intentions towards Israel. It has carried out October the 7th, demonstrating that it will do whatever it can to carry out those intentions as best it can. It has clearly stated that it will do it again and again and again in the future until, in its view, Israel is destroyed. There is no alternative for Israel but to destroy Hamas while trying as best as possible to limit civilian casualties. And that must involve rooting Hamas out of Rafah, ideally with getting as many civilians out of the way as possible, which the IDF, as I understand, is working quite carefully on at the moment in terms of the planning stage.
Peter, do you think it would be a mistake?
Well, I think that it would be terrible if Israel were to go into Rafah. I mean, it's a tent city now. There's almost nowhere in Gaza for people to live. And already the deaths, as I explained, it's as if there were 1 million deaths in Britain. The rate of attrition over the last 5 months was in Britain. And God, I really pray that this doesn't happen. It would be a terrible mistake also by Israel, because for all kinds of reasons. By the way, I just want to say politely that I don't really recognize Jake's idea that there's been wall-to-wall sort of positive media coverage in the mainstream media for Palestine. My view is pretty well the opposite, actually. The mainstream media, by which I mean the Associated, the Murdoch Press, the Express newspapers, Telegraph, have been, generally speaking, extremely pro extremely pro-Israel. If you look at it, so often it's quite upsetting, actually, the dehumanization of Palestinians. Palestinians in news reports, they just mysteriously die, whereas Israelis are killed. And I find that, and generally speaking, the media in Britain has thrown its weight behind the cross-party consensus between Labour and the Tories in favour of the continuation of what has become, I'm afraid, a barbarous war.
I mean, Peter, obviously I agree with you on a couple of points. The first is that the civilian death toll is I mean, I'm not sure what the right adjective is, but civilian deaths are appalling. Of course they are. And I wouldn't for a moment want to suggest that I'm minimising that in any way. But I think I would differ from you in terms of where I ascribe the blame. The IDF is taking measures that are unprecedented in modern warfare to try to limit those civilian casualties, as the Americans have confirmed. And yet Hamas is trying to put civilians in harm's way. Indeed, it constructed the battlefield in order to kill as many of its own civilians as possible, in order to evoke the kind of public outrage which is being expressed widely across the West. But I would say that Israel really has been left between a rock and a hard place. It cannot allow this genocidal enemy to exist. And yet, whenever it tries to fight back, Hamas is trying to get its own civilians killed in order to turn the world against it. But in terms of that media coverage, I would agree with you that on the whole, the right-wing press in this country, the Telegraph in particular, Daily Mail, the Sun, the Times to an extent, has been behind Israel. But really, I was referring to the broadcast media. I think with the broadcast media, for a start, there has been an obsessive focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, eclipsing all other conflicts in the world by an order of magnitude. And there has been a constant thread of bias, not necessarily intentional, coming through that reporting. Just to offer you two examples. One is, of course, the strike on the Al-Ahli hospital, which was a misfired Islamic Jihad missile, which was pinned on Israel immediately by the world's broadcast media in particular, and followed by the press. And the second is the fact, ask yourself, when did you last see any footage coming out of Gaza of a dead Hamas fighter, a dead combatant? The answer will be never, because Hamas censors the media and limits what journalists are exposed to, so that the West is constantly subjected to a barrage of pictures of civilian casualties, making out as if Israel is waging a war on civilians. It is not. It is expressly not.
Well, we'll disagree. I think even the broadcast media, BBC, Sky, ITV in this country has, generally speaking, given Israel a very fair crack of the whip. And there's been all kinds of misreporting out of Israel that which were accepted much too uncritically, in my view, such as this massive sort of complex under Al-Shifa hospital, which is yet to be any proof for, apart from a few faked videos issued by the IO.
That's not true. They're not fake videos. It has been proven. It
was well established. But it was well established, actually, that there was immediately afterwards, in order to give some.
No. It has been confirmed.
And I just say to you, Jake, I would pass on to the IDF. They really haven't done themselves any favours by these fake videos which they've been issuing.
There are no fake videos, Peter. I'm afraid that's incorrect.
Or we'll
under the hospital is an established fact, verified by both Israeli and American intelligence, with evidence.
Look, America cannot be regarded
as fake is profoundly wrong.
Pay more attention, I think I would say to you. But anyway, America cannot be regarded either as an impartial party in this. It's a partial. Joe Biden's wonderful Freudian.
So you say that the Americans are in some way part of a conspiracy of fake news?
I didn't say they are part of a conspiracy of fake. They are not an impartial party in this conflict.
But they have confirmed the tunnels under the hospital. Are you saying that they are a part of a conspiracy pushing fake news?
I'm not part of it. I'm not going into conspiracy theories, by the way.
Peter, if we're looking at, I suppose, beyond the media, if we're looking at what key allies are saying, you mentioned America, it's quite clear from the comments this week, the warnings against Israel not to embark on this operation in Rafah, that if they do press on, you're probably going to have the widest international condemnation of Israel's efforts since the original attack. Do you think that is something that will change Israel's behaviour or will be irrelevant?
I don't know, because I can't see into the mind of Mr. Netanyahu. So I do remember, and I think something has changed, though, between the relationship between the United States and Israel. We've been here before. If you go back 40 years to South Lebanon in 1982, Reagan rang up the Israelis and said, American president said, stop it, stop the atrocities. And within 20 minutes, they'd stopped. There was no there was a sense, Maggie Thatcher called what the Israelis were doing in southern Lebanon pure barbarism. And what we have now is a new reluctance on the West to be a candid friend to Israel and say, look, what you're doing now is utterly unacceptable. It's barbarous. It's doing Israel no favors. It's creating enemies everywhere. And anyway, if you claim to be the greatest democracy in the Middle East and a representative of Western values, no, you don't go around doing what we've seen for the last 4 months, or what Israel was doing in South Lebanon. I wish that Joe Biden had the same willingness that Ronnie Reagan had, a Republican president, to confront Israeli leaders and saying, no, what you're doing is unacceptable, call it off, which is what Reagan was ready to do. And Biden, only 4 or 5 months into this, is at last showing signs that maybe Rafah is a step too far, which indeed it is.
Well, I mean, in response, I would just say that it's quite extraordinary that the way that the worldview that Peter has just been putting forward of the war hasn't mentioned either the fact that Hamas started it with the worst atrocities against Jews since the Holocaust, or the fact that it continues to hold Israeli hostages and has not released them, or the fact that it has pledged to carry out October the 7th again and again and again until Israel is destroyed, or the fact that it is based on a jihadi ideology which is committed, fanatically committed, to the destruction first of the Jews, then to the establishment of a caliphate, and then subsequently to the subjugation of the Christians and of our Western democratic way of life. All of that seems to have been edited out of the narrative, and instead we've been presented with a version of events which is simply an unprovoked aggression by Israel, which is a war against civilians. It's fantasy land. Israel is a Western-style democracy. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. It has been appallingly attacked by a genocidal enemy from a territory from which it withdrew entirely in 2005. It's been attacked within its internationally recognized borders by this jihadi enemy, the same jihadi enemy which would be coming for us and will be if they're not defeated in Gaza, by the way. It's responding according to the rules of law, the rules of war, trying to protect civilians as best it can with unprecedented measures to do so, and to put forward a narrative that this is some sort of Israeli genocide, that the Jews love the killing of babies and so forth, feels to me really quite medieval and totally abstracted from the facts on the ground and from the reality.
Jake, of course, in the introduction, we have been referring to the original Hamas attack. And I think that obviously there are some people who don't mention that. But I think if we talk about what the main debate really happening amongst Western allies about Israel's next step is, it's whether, given the death toll in Gaza is now so high, there are 1 million Palestinians over in Rafah, can the Israeli government really justify going in and upping the civilian death toll even more in the pursuit of trying to eradicate Hamas? And that seems to be the point where the Americans and others are moving against it. So to that, do you think that if Israel looks isolated and alone in doing this, that is something that is going to change their motives? Or actually, is Israel willing to be internationally fairly isolated as a result?
Well, I know that there has been within Israel, within the Israeli war cabinet, a split, a divergence of views with regard to Rafah. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pushing to carry out the Rafah assault and finish the war before Ramadan. That was his initial position. Of course, as Peter mentioned, he is part of the coalition with some right-wing extremists who are really quite unpleasant characters, and he's relying upon them for his political power, which is dragging him to a more extreme position, I feel. But then the other members of the war cabinet have been recognizing that Rafah is an essential battleground, and that needs to be rooted out of there. But has been wanting, the IDF in particular, has been wanting to have the time to prepare to evacuate civilians from that area, which, by the way, is not very easy because, as Peter mentioned, the rest of Hamas, the rest of Gaza is almost inhabitable, for one thing. And secondly, Hamas tries to infiltrate civilian populations and will try to filter out amongst the civilians. So vetting is going to be difficult. So it's a huge logistical operation. But then what happened last week was that Benny Gantz said that Hamas had a deadline of the beginning of Ramadan, which is in a few weeks' time, to release the hostages, at which point Israel would stand down and not attack Rafah. So that gives Israel that period of time to prepare and to try to limit these civilian casualties as much as it can. I reiterate that my position, the position of every thinking and feeling human being, and the position of the vast majority in Israel, and in particular in the Israeli army, is that every innocent Palestinian death is deplorable and regrettable and horrendous. And I wish that Hamas had not started this war, because then Gaza would not be destroyed and Israel wouldn't be forced to take the action that it is being forced into doing. And just to your final point about the international community, I mean, it seems to me that the messaging that has been coming from America about Rafah was not so much don't do it, but don't do it like this. Don't do it with all the civilians still there, with catastrophic civilian casualties and a humanitarian disaster. But I think if I was Hamas, if I was sitting in Rafah listening to the messaging from the US, I would be still worried that Israel would find a way to take away my human shields and come for me. And hopefully that is what will happen.
And Peter, if we're talking about the eradication of Hamas, which Israel is saying once it has got there, then their mission will be complete. Effectively, can there really be any lasting peace in Palestine while Hamas are there, given they are against a two-state solution?
Well, I would like to answer that question by just challenging a statement made by Jake. He rightly said, what about the Hamas atrocities? We've all dealt with those. They're disgusting, foul. But what about the genocidal? What the Western media has been very slow to do is talk about the genocidal statements made by senior Israelis and then echoed right down the ranks. You'll all have seen these horrifying TikTok videos of Israeli soldiers making horrible statements and revolting behavior vis-a-vis Palestinians. But quoted in the International Court of Justice report is a very long document setting out the genocidal statements made by very senior Israelis. And so I will turn that question on its head. Can there be peace in the region while you have people like Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir running the Israeli state?
What do you say to that, Jake?
These statements, if you look at TikTok, if TikTok was around in World War II filming the British forces, of course there would be...
Don't slag off British forces, please. No, I'm not going to have British forces compared to the behaviour of which we have seen on TikTok. No, you've gone too far. Do not attack the British Army in World War II.
If TikTok was around in any warfare engaged in by the democracies, by the British Army, or the Americans, or any other Western armed forces, including in World War II, if TikTok was there, soldiers would be making objectionable videos, because war is a brutal affair. War is hell, and even a just and defensive war is as hellish as any other war, or can be. And so I think to point at TikTok and take your news from there and accuse Israel of genocide because it's just some stupid soldiers making idiotic videos, I think is wrong. Many of the comments that people have objected to made by senior Israeli figures have been mistranslated. There have been some objectionable comments made by Israeli figures, none of them really in many key positions of responsibility, by the way. But it's all been magnified and blown out of proportion. But to form some kind of moral equivalence between villains on the Israeli side, like any other country, Israel has its villains, of course it does. To draw moral equivalence between the villains on the Israeli side, which is basically it's a Western-style democratic country defending itself against a genocidal enemy, and a fundamentally jihadi fanatical regime in Gaza that actually has as its objective to kill as many Jews as possible while putting its own civilians in harm's way. Every civilian killed on either side is a victory for Hamas and a loss for Israel. To create some kind of moral equivalence, to triangulate between good and evil, I think, is a grave sort of abnegation of morality. The truth is that Israel, of course, as I say, has its villains like any other country, but it is not a jihadi regime. And in terms of the hope for peace, Israel would come to the table and would approve a two-state solution tomorrow, I believe, if its security was assured from the Palestinian side, 70% of which is polling support for Hamas at this time.
But can I'm very upset about something Jake said there. My grandfather served in World War II. So both my grandfathers did. My father was a career British Army soldier. Most of my family have some connection with the British Army or British Navy. The British Army did not behave did not behave the way the IDF and are doing. We're seeing the most horrible things happening on these TikTok videos and elsewhere and other coverage, shooting down, an old mum walking through the streets, a grandma in the streets. Now, if that had happened in the British Army, I want to educate you a little bit here about the British Army, Jake. That soldier or officer would have been immediately arrested and court-martialed, because that's what a decent army does. And the British Army, which fought World War II, and my grandfather fought it, and my other grandfather in the Navy, that would never have been past muster. What we are seeing is obscenities from the IDF. And it's over. Don't dismiss it. And I think you've got to deal with this, that something horrible is going on in the IDF.
Peter, both of my grandfathers also served very proudly in the RAF. So I went to
I honour them. And they wouldn't have committed those atrocities which we're seeing from the IDF either.
What I will say is perhaps it's a mistake to take your information too much from TikTok. And also, if you seek to encourage me to be educated about World War II, I would encourage you in return to think about the firebombing of Dresden, in which British forces killed 25,000 German men, women and children in a single night. So don't lecture me about the morality of the British Army.
So you're comparing what Israel is doing in Gaza to Dresden. That's a very interesting comparison.
If I may finish, Peter. Like you, I believe that the British Army is among the most moral in the world. And it does court-martial anybody who acts out of line, as does the Israeli army, by the way, which is fighting an existential war equivalent to ours in World War II. Court-martials exist in the Israeli forces as well as in the British armed forces, and the TikTok stuff about Israeli people gunning down Palestinians in cold blood, I would very much advise a dose of caution in taking your news from TikTok.
These are all authenticated cases. Many of them have unfortunately been proven. I'd like to see the evidence. I hope the Israeli Defense Forces are indeed arresting, court-martialing and punishing very severely what seems to be cold-blooded murder carried out in many of these videos we've seen, not just on TikTok, by the way. It's a very serious matter. If we are, as a civilized country, we in Britain, who can be very proud of our armed forces. I know there have been the occasion, but are going to support Israel. We need to know that we are supporting a country which has the civilized values which we hold in Britain. And
which it does, unlike Hamas, by the way.
I'm not defending Hamas. I've condemned them repeatedly. I've never had no trouble at all. I condemn anybody who abuses human rights, who murders in cold blood. I condemn anybody wherever they come from.
But it's just strange that when Katie asks about the two-state solution and possibilities for peace, and would it be possible with Hamas still in existence, you then said, well, what about the Israeli genocide?
I didn't. It's a false. What I pointed out.
You criticised Hamas with one sentence, but then veer off onto the Israelis very, very quickly indeed.
No, I pointed when you talked about Hamas, the atrocities you said they committed. I said what we need to bear in mind also the genocidal comments made by the as the International Court of Justice has demonstrated, made by very senior Israeli politicians, including the president, including the prime minister, and also we see them on TikTok. That's why you mustn't misrepresent, Jake, in a conversation as grave as this what I'm saying.
I wouldn't dream of it, Peter. I wouldn't.
Good, I'm glad about that.
And with that, I think we're going to have to wrap this one up. So thank you, Jake. Thank you, Peter, for joining today.